You are listening to Synaxis Podcast. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Josh.
And today we're going to take a look at the Gnostic heritage of heavy metal. It's this essay I found doing research for my channel. I have a YouTube channel called The Metal Mystic. It has been very divisive, but the whole mission of it is to just kind of evaluate occultism in metal from an Orthodox Christian point of view, because I am a recovering metalhead, and since converting, I've definitely realized that a lot of my favorite artists were into occultism, and so my YouTube channel is about exploring that and looking at the philosophical implications of that, and that's kind of what we're doing today on this episode of the podcast, because I found this paper, and I thought it was a good place to kind of jump off into a lot of stuff about the philosophy behind heavy metal. So yeah, I guess we could just get into it. The paper we're looking at, it was published in Culture and Religion, an Interdisciplinary Journal. I got a PDF. I can put this link in the description.
Nice.
So everyone can check it out if they want. It's called The Gnostic Heritage of Heavy Metal by Daniel Belgrad. In the abstract, goes like this. It says, "The religious impulse in early heavy metal music is fundamentally Gnostic, an ancient religious tradition emphasizing the rule of evil and the remoteness of salvation. Gnosticism was integrated into hard rock music in the late 1960s. Early heavy metal musicians encountered Gnosticism as it had been absorbed into popular fiction and film, including especially the works of Dennis Wheatley and J.R.R. Tolkien," which I kind of going to push back on that.
Dude, I was going to say
Tolkien's
that,
definitely not Gnostic.
I was reading that part and was like, I wouldn't have pictured it as a Gnostic world. But.
No. Prominent in giving Gnosticism musical form was the band Black Sabbath, whose first three albums in 1970 and 1971 pioneered the patterns of musical practice that would become the conventions of the genre. Heavy metal's alternately heavy and giddy effect, created via a synthesis of musical practices and complementary verbal and visual representations, brought Gnostic beliefs into meaningful intersection with the everyday lives of young blue-collar males in Britain and the United States as they confronted the post-industrial age in the context of a waning 60s counterculture. So yeah, he opens up the paper by talking about how that there is a very explicit religious impulse behind heavy metal as a subculture, especially in the themes and the names, obviously, of the bands. Judas Priest, Black Sabbath. He brings up Led Zeppelin at the beginning too, and Led Zeppelin's pretty notorious for, especially their guitarist Jimmy Page was very into occult stuff, and Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, he lived in one of Aleister Crowley's houses, right? I think
he bought his house. Yeah. He had an occult bookstore called Equinox, so he was he was a big collector of all the magical stuff he could get a hold of, and that would be a cool deep dive because he's one of the most famous occultists in heavy metal music or classic rock or however you want to categorize them, but definitely super influential. And so obviously this guy's thesis is that the religious impulse behind heavy metal is Gnostic rather than satanic. He kind of makes a contrast there where it's like a lot of people think it's satanic, but it's actually Gnostic. I don't draw too sharp a line between those two things myself. And obviously, since we're coming from an Orthodox Christian perspective, as we go through this, we'll see that he kind of blurs the lines too in a lot of places.
Yeah, a lot of Gnostic stuff gets explicitly Luciferian at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm sure that maybe some Gnostics a long time ago wouldn't have associated with that kind of thing, but there is a lot of strands of Gnosticism that are like Lucifer's the light bringer and he's the good guy. And especially with the view that the Demiurge, a lot of early Gnostics thought that Jehovah, the Demiurge, like the god of the Jews, they said was the bad guy god, the created god. So,
yeah, the Old Testament creator god is tyrannical, and he's a god of evil. And that's kind of what he gets into on the next page, because he talks about how the Gnostic worldview is very based in the duality of Manichaeanism, which is the idea that there are two equal and opposing forces, the light and dark, the good and the bad.
They're in an eternal struggle with each other too.
Yeah, you see that in Zoroastrianism, where it's like
a lot of Persian thought.
Ahriman and the good god, I forgot the good god.
Ahura Mazda.
Ahura Mazda, yeah, Ahriman and Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism are an illustration of that, like the Manichaean struggle, the dualism between good and evil.
of like, yeah, equal opposing forces eternally battling.
Yeah, exactly. Equal opposing forces. And Orthodox Christianity, pretty much all Christianity, definitely the Orthodox Holy Fathers don't take that view. And we'll definitely get into that because St. Basil, I got St. Basil right here. So, so yeah, they make this, I would characterize this as a false dialectic between these two equal and opposing forces. And the Orthodox view is that evil is not, it's not a substance in itself. It's a privation. It's not an equal and an opposite force to good. It's just an absence of the good.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly the right theological terms, but the way I always understood it is that like the good has a greater ontological status. So like light and heat are measurable and quantifiable, and coldness and darkness aren't opposed to it in the same way. They're a lack, they're a negation of the thing. So it's not that, from the created world, it might seem like they're equal opposing things, but one has a greater status and one's the lack of the prior.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to see St. Basil talks about how like he'll compare good to eyesight and evil to blindness, and like good is health and evil is illness, where it's just there's a lack of something that's causing and so just right out of the gate, that is what the Gnostic worldview is based in, is that struggle between these two opposing forces, and that's gonna inform most of what we're gonna look at here. So this writer, Daniel Belgrad, he writes, in the Gnostic worldview, also often referred to in both popular and scholarly contexts as Manichaeanism, this world is not of God's making. While the mainstream Judeo-Christian myth attributes to God the creation of this world and humankind, by contrast, the ancient Gnostics posited that the creator spirit, the jealous God of the Old Testament, was actually Satan or an evil demiurge. This creator, having been expelled from heaven by the true God, made this universe as a facsimile of heaven, trapping in it the bits of divine soul that animate human beings. Thus, the earth has always been under evil's sway. We are literally in hell on earth, but evil's plot is its own undoing, for the pieces of divine soul trapped in our material bodies are infiltrators from the forces of light behind enemy lines in the kingdom of darkness, and the true God periodically sends emissaries, like the serpent in Eden, to penetrate Satan's defenses and prevent these trapped souls from despairing entirely. Thus, to the Gnostics, Eve's choice to eat from the tree of knowledge was a valiant act of disobedience, albeit one punished by the Lord of this world. And we're already seeing a satanic inversion there.
Rebellion good.
Rebellion's good. The serpent that we've always identified as Satan and the bringer of evil, whose temptation caused the fall of man and the cosmos, is seen as a hero and a bringer of wisdom. And even just in this paragraph, he identifies the God of the Old Testament with Satan and the serpent with God. And so it's just immediately a complete inversion of the Christian view of things, which is pretty striking to me. So this part, and then this is the part of the paper where he gets into Tolkien and Dennis Wheatley, which I thought was pretty interesting. I don't agree with his take on Tolkien. I don't think that he was a Gnostic. In fact, he's pretty openly a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of some revisionism. A lot of the stuff in this paper is just this weird inversion and revisionism of history, history and theology and stuff.
Yeah, I definitely I had some problems with that too when I read it. I was like, dude, he did not put a Gnostic worldview in here.
Yeah, but it is interesting that's how they took it.
Yeah, how it could be interpreted that way.
Yeah. In the Silmarillion, there's a whole creation story at the beginning of it. And that's like the mythological history of Middle Earth and stuff. And Iluvatar is the god of ultimate goodness. This guy writes, Tolkien imagined a god of ultimate goodness, Iluvatar, who remains aloof and inaccessible, while a malicious demiurgic power governs Middle Earth. Like the Gnostic demiurge, Melkor, against Iluvatar's wishes, enters the void in search for secret fire, yet having failed to find it, nevertheless introduces his own. In this collaborative genesis, he distorts creation itself. And I don't know if he brings it up later, but I remember in that story, in the creation story of the Silmarillion, Iluvatar sings creation into existence, and Melkor, who is the satanic character, this embodiment of evil, he arises as a dissonance or a disharmony in the song that Iluvatar sings. And so I can see how that could be interpreted as Gnostic because of that relationship.
Yeah.
But I think it's more accurate to assign that to the definition of good and evil that we were talking about from the Christian point of view, especially since Tolkien was a traditional Catholic.
There is an absolute evil and there is an idea of absolute good. Would you agree? Mordor, after all, is a principle of absolute evil.
I don't believe in absolute evil, but I do believe in absolute good. Yeah. Let's say...
If you don't believe in absolute evil, why did you create the Dark Lord, who seems to be the apotheosis of it?
But he said in the book that he himself was not evil to begin with.
Ah, he fell. Mm-hmm. Then, like Lucifer.
Yeah.
So you're...
Well, he's several stages down from Lucifer.
Yeah, I think the Odyssey, like the problem of evil, is like a trouble in any worldview. And I understand why, even if someone doesn't look at like ancient Gnosticism, like the suffering in the world and death and pain and stuff, like unless they have some way to interpret that, and they might fall into like a dualistic position where like, well, God's also all the evil and maybe it's necessary and it's good, kind of. I can see why you could go to some kind of Gnostic turn.
Yeah, and I think that what the Gnostics are trying to explain when they say, the Creator God is evil, and we need to be freed from the material universe that he imprisoned us in, they're trying to make sense of what we experience as a fallen world. Yeah. And I think that the true way to look at it, I would argue, is that this is a fallen world that was created good, but it's not really God's fault. It's through free will and the misuse of it that we've been brought into this kind of lower state of being in this lesser quality of life and experience of the world. And it does feel like a material prison in a lot of ways. And that's why we have, you get the sentiment throughout the Bible that Satan is the Lord of this world. And as we keep saying, this is an inversion of that, where this evil God is the creator God, but the good God is the rebel, is the Satan figure.
There's almost like an analogy between like the fallen angel and the fallen world. So I can see why people would like intuitively be like, there's some connection. Yeah,
because through the fall, by allowing ourselves to be overcome by passion and sin, we also allow ourselves to come under the sway of fallen spirits. And so we experience this world as being under the reign of evil. And I think that's what those passages in the Bible are trying to illuminate when they say Satan is the Lord of this world.
It's like one of the dangers of like looking at like old spiritual texts and stuff like the Bible, or pretty much from any tradition, is like, look at how many different interpretations you can have of simple verses. Like you can just open up some old text and be like, whoa, the Demiurge, and like you can interpret things in a pretty insane amount of ways, and people have. Like all the early heresies that were argued against are just some misinterpretation or hyper focus on one point that's not sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So then he's gonna go into Dennis Wheatley. Dennis Wheatley wrote the novel The Devil Rides Out. This writer writes, in which a hero wielding white magic, the right-hand path, rescues a victim from a coven of Satanists. In The Devil Rides Out, the Duc de Richelieu must save his friend from the Satanists before they consummate their Black Sabbath, because Black Sabbath is the point of no return when participants pass beyond all help of the light. Richelieu's gnosis is Manichaean, as Wheatley takes pains to explain to his reader.
Rex, do you believe in evil as an idea? Do you believe in the power of darkness? That's a superstition. Now there you are wrong. The power of darkness is more than just a superstition. It is a living force which can be tapped at any given moment of the night.
The Duke spoke of the eternal fight which, hidden from human eyes, has been waged from time immemorial between the powers of light and the powers of darkness. So yeah, and then this writer talks about an essay that Wheatley wrote. He wrote it in 1947. It was called A Letter to Posterity, and he hid it in the walls of his house, and it was found when his house was demolished in 1969. In its and this is from the paper, Wheatley advocated the formation of a subversive counterculture composed of secret groups of friends to contest the rise of the totalitarian state. So subversive counterculture is definitely a phrase that jumps out at me. And one thing I think that we should talk about while we're here is weaponized toxic culture.
Yeah.
Which I think is very relevant to genres like heavy metal and just rock in general. Like, definitely the 60s counterculture.
Yeah, that was like the Congress of Cultural Freedom. Was that like the CIA front that like tried to promote certain kinds of like free hippie kinds of loving stuff?
Yeah,
like,
that sounds right.
Yeah, I think that's the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And it's like openly a CIA front. Now it's all known, but yeah.
Yeah, and then also I've read so many theories that like institutes like the Tavistock Institute, and I've read a lot of things where they were explicitly trying to manufacture popular trends and popular music to steer the masses in a certain way. And there's so many. I mean, there's one of the probably the most prominent books about the fabricated counterculture is Weird Scenes in the Canyon, I think is what it's called.
Yeah,
Dave McGowan.
Yeah.
Where he talks about all the weird military ties of all like the 60s counterculture.
Yeah, in Laurel Canyon, right?
Yeah, and
yeah, a bunch of weird connections. Like Jim Morrison's dad was like involved with the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, he was like a military admiral.
Yeah, during
Navy
like an
admiral.
American false flag thing. It's like pretty weird.
Yeah.
Weird connection.
Yeah, and there's so many of those weird connections, and then like Charlie Manson's like in the middle of it. Like it goes all over the place. There's so many rabbit holes there, but the main thread is that there are subversive forces manufacturing counterculture to steer the world in the way that they want it to go. And that goes into because there are a lot of theories that Tavistock basically created the Beatles and the entire Beatles phenomenon. And that kind of thing just makes you wonder how many things were fabricated like that.
Yeah, it's one of those ones I never looked into. I remember like seeing stuff pop up about that, and I just never really checked.
Yeah, I've never followed up or tried to track down like sources for it or anything, but that's a very popular conspiracy theory.
Yeah, totally.
And it just makes you wonder how many of them, because we're going to get into Black Sabbath in this paper, and just in my own research on them, they definitely have some weird ties to they recorded at least one, I think a few albums at one of Richard Branson's mansions, and he's kind of in those elite circles. And then they also ended up being on Miles Copeland's record label at a certain point, and that guy is an absolute CIA spook. His dad wrote Game of Nations, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
And it's funny because he has got a brother. I forgot his brother's name. There's another Copeland. Stuart Copeland is the drummer for the Police, who's one of his brothers, and then there's a third brother, and they're all in the music industry.
Interesting.
And they have like 3 or 4 different record labels, and they're all called like IRS, CIA, FBI.
Oh, weird.
But they stand for different things, but they use the same anagrams or
interesting
acronyms. And Interscope, his brother was in charge of Interscope, which I've heard they were the ones that manufactured like the gangster rap trend.
Yeah.
Quick correction, turns out Ian Copeland was not involved with Interscope. That was David Geffen's record company, and they were in control of the gangster rap label Death Row Records.
Yeah, I've heard a bunch of stories about this. I mean, those things are hard to find sources of, but it's a long, like, that's something that's floated around in conspiracy world forever.
Mm-hmm.
There was some meeting about, like, all right, guys, we're playing degenerate gangster rap now.
Yeah, to push toxic culture on a certain demographic of people.
Yeah.
And get them into drugs and sex and just enslave their minds.
Yeah,
basically.
Totally. That's a thing historically. I mean, that goes back to a lot of, like, Machiavelli stuff. Like, I'm pretty sure a lot of the ancient rulers were like, yeah, just use toxic things to mess with your enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, there's a lot of overt satanic symbolism and religiosity wrapped up in that too. It's definitely relevant and it's really interesting. So yeah, the subversive counterculture thing is definitely a big part of this.
It's funny because almost intuitively, just listening to metal, like even if you were from another culture and you couldn't hear the lyrics, just hearing how dissonant the music is, you can almost intuit that it's not the kind of thing that is saying loving messages about God or the universe. Or
totally.
Like that.
I mean, they use it in warfare. There was a Wasp album came out in like 2001 or 2002 after 9/11, and I remember reading Blackie Lawless is like the main frontman and songwriter for Wasp, and like the liner notes of that album, he said he wrote that album for soldiers to go kill Iraqis too, because he was like a New Yorker and he hated them for that thing that happened.
Yeah.
And he said that he got letters from like soldiers who were fighting in that war, who they would just blast that record when they were going to into battle to just like strike terror into the terrorists that they were fighting. So there's definitely something to that.
Yeah, it's like the ancient idea of being like enchanted, had chants and music having like influence over your mind and stuff. Like, yeah, certain kinds of music can totally get you into certain moods. Obviously, people kind of intuitively know that, you know. People will have like, oh, I'm gonna go do like put on some workout music, and it's something with like a higher tempo, and it's like, yeah, music affects you and your mind and how you feel.
Yeah, another good thing I would have liked to looked at a little more for this episode is just like Plato's idea about music.
Yeah.
Because he thought there were certain modes that you probably should just never listen to, but the best, if I remember right, the best ones were for either contemplation or warfare, were the two kinds of music that he thought were like the most useful. But
yeah, I forget exactly what it was. I think one of the stories about Pythagoras on Samos, like in Greece a long time ago, was like there become stories and like myths about him that he like walk around with a lute and play like hit the resonant frequency of a building and like collapse a wall or something. And I don't know if that's true, probably an exaggeration. But one of the things associated with him is that they had some kind of large instrument that was like flipped upside down, or it was maybe strings on the bottom, and people would lay on top of it and they would play music as like a form of therapy. And I know like the old Chinese Taoists have similar ideas that like music and certain notes have to do with certain organs. And that by playing certain sounds that you could like heal people in certain ways.
That reminds me of that David Bowie clip we looked at where he talked about like the black note and how they could use it to just wreak havoc and destruction.
Yeah.
And we could even drop that in here.
What is black noise?
Black noise?
Yeah.
Black noise is something that Burroughs got very interested in. It's
intriguing.
Well, no, it's one facet of black noise is that everything, like a glass, if an opera singer hits a particular note, the vibrations are that of the metabolism of the glass, and it cracks it, yeah? So black noise is the register within which you can crack a city or people, or it's a new controlled bomb. It's a noise bomb, in fact, which can destroy.
Is it a real thing? I mean, is it something that's actually somebody's experimenting with?
It was invented in France.
Could a tyrant use it to...
Well, until last year, you could buy the patent for it in the French patent office for about equivalent to $3-4.
And it would wipe out it's concentrated...
It depends how much money you put into it. I mean, a small one could probably kill about half the people here, but a big one could destroy a city, or even more. I mean...
It's a weird idea.
Don't look at... It's not my idea.
No.
Yeah, you hit the resonant frequency. It's how opera singers can like break a glass. Like certain things will vibrate like almost uncontrollably if you like hit the sound that vibrates things at like a molecular level.
Yeah, that's crazy. So
yeah, like one of the weird things about like metal and music is it's almost like it's intuitive that like metal is... It's like dissonant and like oppositional at like a mathematical level. Like it's not harmonious, and the things don't find harmony and sympathy in the same way that like things that people consider pretty music does.
Yeah.
It's almost at like a fundamental mathematical level. There's opposition. And it's really obvious. Like I'm sure if you showed metal music to like a tribal person that didn't speak the language, it would so obviously be something they're like, what is going on here? Like it's so chaotic and so crazy, and like even... Like symbolically it's that, usually verbally, and like the lyrics are like that, but even at like a mathematical level, like it's almost like the notes you're using are in conflict with the ones right next to it, and it's crazy.
And absolutely, and this paper gets into it with Black Sabbath and the tritone, like their self-titled song utilized the tritone, which it's kind of a myth, but in the public mind that has been associated with like the devil's tritone. A lot of people kind of say that like in the Dark Ages, like the Catholic Church tried to ban it, which isn't true. You can go back and find Catholic hymns that use the tritone in it.
Yeah.
But it's because of that relationship, that dissonant relationship, that it's been associated with chaos and devilry and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think even one of the common things is like in scary movies, like when they're trying to like make people on edge, they usually do things that are like really dissonant in that way.
Yeah,
they'll,
the
like,
Jaws theme.
Yeah, totally. Or they'll do like the shing, they'll take like metal and like slide it across something, because it's the same kind of thing. It creates like a lot of dissonance, and you're like, whoa, what is going on? It's like, it doesn't sound in the way that we like intuit as like good, beautiful music. It's like some chaotic, it's like something bad is happening.
And it's interesting that Tolkien used that imagery for like his origin of his devil character. That dissonance, that disharmony with the Song of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the next part of this paper, it gets into the lived experience of metalheads, especially like the emergence of metal in places like Birmingham, England, with Black Sabbath, and which was Judas Priest is from there too, which was a very industrialized factory town
with both explicitly anti-Christian names.
Yeah, right. Black Sabbath, Judas Priest. That's one thing. I remember because I had a band in high school, and we named it Crimson Saint because of that naming pattern. And like most of like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, but there's like a good and evil like dichotomy. So it's that same kind of dialectic pattern, and that's why we chose that name. Looking back, I don't think it's a great name, but that was what we were going for. So he talks about the origins of heavy metal are linked with the experience of adolescent working class masculinity in the context of deindustrialization. So he starts talking about like the experience of the working class youth in places like Birmingham and obviously other places, and that feeling of just like societal oppression and rigid class structure, and this feeling of being enslaved, and how that fits into the Gnostic worldview of this Demiurge trapping us, imprisoning us in a material realm.
Gnosticism might inherently appeal to anyone who feels like trapped in their situations. Yeah. And if they feel like the situation is just how the universe is supposed to, like, oh, this is just what humans do, I'm supposed to just struggle here in this menial thing, and then like it might appeal to someone and be like, oh, maybe it's all a trap.
Yeah, definitely. And then he goes into schools are experienced as prisons in which the students are innocent prisoners, which is definitely something I felt in high school. And my inner angsty teen really related to a lot of the imagery in this part of the essay because of that feeling of oppression, like just like this hard to articulate, just like instinctual feeling that we're imprisoned in this situation.
Being taken and put with people your age for like 8 hours a day, being forced to learn about a bunch of stuff feels like a bad situation as a kid. I get it. Yeah,
especially when that's another tangent, beginning into like just like the Rockefeller school system. And
there's a reason why like that model wasn't used everywhere in every culture for a long time. Like the way the modern schooling happens is a pretty recent phenomena.
And it's made to break the will of the people who are in it and to program them into being just mindless servants.
Yeah, I always heard that it was the school system makes people smart enough to like sign their name and get themselves into contracts, but not really smart enough to figure out what's going on in the world. No one knows how money is created or how fractional reserve banking works, but everyone can just, engage and get in contracts.
That sounds right. So, so he talks about metalhead youth who described their lives as plagued by oppressive, relentless, and suffocating surveillance by adults who, despite their own mendacity and selfishness, exercise absolute authority. And then he also starts talking about experiences of domestic violence, especially with abusive fathers, and how those are related to the evil creator spirit of Gnostic tradition. He writes, the evil creator spirit of Gnostic tradition is the apotheosis of the abusive father figure. So a lot of people who just don't have great dads
have abusive dads. They view the god of the universe as an abusive god, kind of.
Yeah, and
there might be correlations to that kind of stuff. Like maybe if someone doesn't have their dad around, they're more likely to have like deist views or something at some point in their life. They're like, my dad wasn't really around. Maybe God doesn't care. Maybe he's just not really around. It probably is hard to not somehow take your personal life experience and then try to like put it onto the cosmos as a whole.
That kind of ties into the crisis of masculinity that has been observed in modern times, and the anti-patriarchal impulse in a lot of just modern politics, I guess you could characterize that way. But this reminds me of the PSYOP Cinema guys keep bringing up this interview that I also haven't looked at but have been meaning to, with Frank Zappa, where he talks about the military-industrial complex, which I think he calls it the Squadron, is his name for it, and how they are trying to manipulate people through television to have the sentiment of the bumbling idiot dad, and to just kind of destroy the image of the father figure, like in popular culture. And I think he cites like Homer Simpson and Married with Children dad and stuff like that, and how that's actually a coordinated effort to get rid of fatherhood and patriarchy, and that you can see that in the Gnostic worldview, and which is, I think we've been kind of making it obvious that we would identify that with the satanic worldview of just like anti-God, anti-Christ. So yeah, but this whole, I mean, I like I said, I really related to this part because I was feeling a lot of this stuff, like this sense of oppression, like the destruction of creativity. There's this part that says, Robert Anderson's analysis of the religious content in heavy metal lyrics correlates them with these aspects of Gnosticism as described by theologian Hans Jonas. The remoteness of the true God, the creator is an evil demiurge, the world is a prison in which the malevolent creator deity has trapped the human spirit, and gnosis, encountered via either asceticism or libertinism as a means of escape and salvation. By contrast, organized religions were experienced as just another adult institution, corrupt and stultifying. According to Gaines, religion, God, and spirituality are always big topics on the street. Everyone says the Bible says the world is going to end, but kids on the street here, as elsewhere, are skeptical about organized religion, about the established definition of God. They think it's phony, corrupt. Wherever they have been taught to look for good, they find evil. And the papers are full of atrocities perpetrated by adults on kids. So kids start to look in all the places adults tell them are evil. They figure maybe what adults say is evil is really good. So yeah, that distrust of authority, that angsty teenage rebellion stage where you start to get disappointed and distrustful of adults in your life, and like the way they described it, where you start to figure, well, maybe the kind of things they tried to instill in me were bad, and so you just try to look for the alternative. It's a good description of that mentality, that feeling, and I was definitely there in my angsty metal teenage years, and there's a really deep kind of despair in that. And I think he's really right by identifying the Gnostic worldview with that feeling, but recognizing the corruption in the world. The corruption doesn't necessarily mean that God is bad, and I think that's kind of the argument I was trying to articulate earlier. It's just like Gnosticism just kind of, as we've been saying the whole time, just kind of tangles things up and inverts them, especially for angsty, confused kids who are just bewildered by what they experience in a world like this, the corruption and the oppression. And I think that there's something in this that's part of the dialectic, because as we'll see, the way that they try to escape it is through like drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Yeah. And that's kind of the dichotomy that they draw, is like there's this oppressive world, and you escape it through ecstasy, basically.
Yeah, the libertine way out, right?
Yeah, libertinism, yeah, instead of asceticism.
Yeah, Gnosticism is super similar to the Matrix. I think we said that in the last one. It's the idea that you're in a world and it's trapped you in there, and the architect is kind of a bad guy who trapped you in, and you should really be getting out because this is like a prison, and not everyone really knows. That's like the gnosis, the secret knowledge, is figuring out what's going on, and it's hidden from you because the architect wants to hide it from you. So yeah, the whole thing is premised on, you're part of something, and there's a god, and there's something going on, but it's inherently bad, and it's trapped you. It's suspicious of everything. So it takes the idea of like hierarchy, or like the archetypal understanding of like sometimes kings are tyrannical, and there's an order above you that doesn't seem fair or just, and it just imposes that onto God and the universe in general. So it's like you should be suspicious of the universe, the cosmos in general. It's all bad. It's trapped you here, and you just need secret knowledge and to get out.
Yeah, and there's definitely a sentiment, as we've said, that the material world is evil. Matter itself is an imprisoning lower level existence, and it's something we need to be liberated from.
Yeah, they think that, like, consciousness or whatever, it has to do with, like, light. I think that's one of the Gnostic things, is that we're, like, divine sparks, but we're trapped in matter.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, that's what matter does, is it obstructs light. That's how we see shadows in the world, is when there's light, and then there's matter, or something that obstructs it. All of a sudden, the light doesn't go to the other side of it. So they see all of this as, like, we're light that needs to get out of the body. Like, us being in here, we're trapped. This is a problem.
These meat sacks are imprisoning us, and we need to shed them in order to actually experience freedom. And that's another thing that the Christians would say, and we said this in the first episode, that the matter through Christ's incarnation has been redeemed, and matter in and of itself is not evil, and the human structure of body and soul, it was created that way for a reason, and both of those things are what makes us human. And it's not just...
Yeah, it's not a dualism where the soul is good and the body is bad.
Yeah.
We need to escape this. We're trapped here.
Yeah, there's a holistic unity between those two things. The union of opposites that are reunited in Christ, in his divinity and his humanity. Let's see, what else we got here? And so he goes into the song lyrics of Black Sabbath, the Gnostic motifs in them. There is the song Lord of this World, which is definitely has that interplay in it. I had the lyrics up. I probably can't play a clip from it. I would probably get flagged. But okay, so he writes, Black Sabbath's early work also reflects the influence of Dennis Wheatley's writings. Their lead lyricist, Geezer Butler, was an avid Dennis Wheatley fan. As he explained in an interview, I was getting into a lot of, not practicing, but reading a lot of spiritualism, black magic, and white magic, and all that kind of stuff, which is, what a lot of people were doing at the time.
Getting into, not practicing, but reading a lot of spiritualism, black magic, and white magic, and all that kind of stuff, which, a lot of people were doing at the time.
So then we have this dichotomy between white and black magic, which we saw earlier. And he goes into that letter to posterity that Wheatley hid in his walls. And I think this is really kind of revelatory for the spirit behind this Gnostic idea. In the letter he writes, "Rebel, we are sent into this world to develop our own personality, to use such gifts as we have been given, and to set an example to others by our courage, fortitude, sympathy, generosity, and self-reliance. Any state which controls the lives of the people and dictates where they shall live, what work they shall do, what they shall see, say, hear, read, and think, thwarts the free development of personality and is therefore evil. It will be immensely difficult to break the stranglehold of the machine, but it can be done little by little, the first step being the formation of secret groups of friends for free discussion. Then numbers of people can begin systematically to break small regulations, and so to larger ones with passive resistance by groups of people pledged to stand together. And eventually the boycotting or ambushing and killing of unjust, tyrannous officials. Your life does not matter, but your freedom does. The age-old wisdom tells us that death is not to be feared, for it is but a release from life. Therefore, if need be, fight for your right to live, work, and love, how and where you will. If need be, die for it. Your death will be an example to others that it is better to die fighting for your freedom and happiness than to live on as a slave. May the courage of wisdom of the timeless ones who order all things be your support and guide. They will never fail you if you have faith in yourself. Blessings upon you, freedom and love be with you." And so he compares that letter to a fan letter that was sent to the music magazine Circus that featured metal music in it. And that letter says, "There's a new breed of kids out there, the real metal, Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, Motley Crue, Ozzy, have our spirit and love. We believe that Satan rules and would rather blow up this wicked world than let it fall to the communists. We live to be high and want nothing to do with reality. We don't care about ourselves, just each other. Violence to those we hate, love to our friends, and the breed. May everyone be a slut if you can understand love to you." So there's this weird sleight of hand there that's been happening the whole time, where at the beginning of this paper it said the creator god was Satan and he's bad, but now Satan rules and he's awesome, and he's like he's our key to rebellion and liberty and stuff like that.
Yeah, do whatever you want, do as thou wilt.
Do what thou wilt. Yeah. And yeah, exactly, do as thou wilt is all. That's the theme of all of this here. rebel, be what you are. And that sounds nice. But I mean, but then you get this stuff like, we don't want to have anything to do with reality. We just want to get high. We just want everyone to be a slut. And that's just degeneracy. And that's,
yeah.
And I mean, the word degeneracy is the perfect word for that, because it degenerates you. And like, it just leads to dissolution and self-destruction. And I think that's part of the dialectic of the toxic culture. And you could kind of understand it in that way of like the oppression and the liberty are part of that dialectic to send people to just spiral out into the self-destruction of drugs, sex, and rock and roll that presents itself as a way of escape, but it's really just a way into deeper slavery to the passions.
Yeah, it's definitely like a dialectic. Like it's being part of an order that sucks in, industrial 70s UK or whatever, these people that don't have the ideal experience. And then it's like a rebellion from that, want like the ultimate freedom, which definitely has like the Gnostic and kind of satanic undertones.
Absolutely. And that dichotomy of oppression and ecstasy and release are actually what he later calls the heavy metal dialectic, which is reflected in the musical patterns themselves. And so he'll talk about like the heavy oppressive chord changes of like the guitar riffs of Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath songs, and then like the really ecstatic guitar solo sections and stuff, and the way they interplay between each other are a reflection of that dichotomy between chaos and order and oppression and ecstasy. Escapism through sex, loud music, and drugs played a central role in early heavy metal lifestyle. So that escapism, a lot of people are driven through that, or driven to that, and that's definitely identified with like Dionysian revelry, which I think is, I guess that you can kind of name that as religious expression, I guess, of this kind of worldview, because this whole paper is based on the religious expression in heavy metal. So yeah, he writes here the lived experiences of Donna Gaines, who wrote a book called Teenage Wasteland, where she documents the experience of these metalhead kids. It's characterized by a pervasive feeling of oppression, punctuated by moments of giddy transcendence. And this is heavy metal's characteristic musical form, an alternation between musical phrases that are by turn menacing and ecstatic. He calls this the heavy metal dialectic. This effective heavy/giddy dialectic has been described by Doug Pinnick of the progressive metal band King's X as very dark yet also uplifting. It's consistent with the musical encoding of the Gnostic vision of life as hell on earth, the pervasive oppression and heaviness from which the soul tries valiantly to escape in giddy and ecstatic flight.
Interesting. I can kind of see what it's the implicit, like the chugs and the galloping and all the crazy deep chord structures, the chaos of the menial world for the Gnostic, and the escape is like the guitar solo that's some ecstatic libertine life of escaping the menial kind of thing. So even in a weird symbolic way, like I can see how the music is kind of like that.
Yeah, and I wrote in my notes that that's reflective of that Manichaean dialectic, the struggle between the two equal forces of light and dark. And that's also, I think, what's illustrated by like the Masonic checkerboard pattern, and in some ways the yin yang.
Yeah.
There's something to that. Yeah. So the dialectic. Then he just starts describing some Black Sabbath songs. I mean, we talked about the like the tritone and the dissonance. The flat second is the Jaws thing, where it's like that really tense,
yeah, totally
tense, scary, oppressive sounds. Yeah, and then he talks about the Devil's Interval, which he just kind of regurgitates the rumor that it was banned in the church, but it wasn't. Adam Neely has a really good video about why that's a myth, where he goes into the history of it and how early church music has tritones in it, but they're just kind of really hard to write around.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it strategically if you compose well, but like if you just walk up to any instrument and hit a tritone, like I get why it's more dissonant than you want to write easily into music.
Yeah. And he talks about Tony Iommi, Black Sabbath's guitarist, was working in a foundry, a metal foundry, and the day he was going to quit his job to do Black Sabbath full time, his finger got crushed in the machine, or 2 of his fingers got crushed, and they got hit. They were severed, and so he had to replace them with like nubs and down tune his guitar and stuff, and that's how they got that heavy, crunchy sound. And so like his lived experience of like the industrial society actually like manifested like just through his suffering, and then it turned, he I guess alchemized it, you could say, into that sound that we know as metal now, because that's usually where music historians will say like this is where metal started, like Tony Iommi's guitar sound. Yeah, where do we go from there? I think it's important. I've tried to do it before, but like there's definitely a sleight of hand in here where it began by saying Satan is identified as the oppressor, and the Demiurge and the creator god, like those 3 were identified at first. But as we went through the paper, either unconsciously or consciously, they got flipped to where by the end of it, Satan was actually the liberator. And I mean, even in the beginning, it started out by identifying the serpent as a liberator. Yeah. And as a messenger from the true good God. But there's just a weird linguistic sleight of hand there, where Satan gets switched out from the bad guy to the good guy. Yeah, because if your worldview is that the universe is, the whole thing is like a trap or a prison, like the Matrix, that traps you in, then if you look at a lot of the mythology of things, they'll always look at the liberator figure as the person who's freeing you from the bad god who's trapped you there. So Lucifer is the light bearer, Prometheus stealing the fire from Zeus. Like every character symbolically that's going to have to do with like rebellion, they're going to look at as a really positive figure, because if they think that you're trapped by the bad guy, then anyone who tries to show up and who's like, yo, this guy's a bad guy, you know, any deceptive serpent that shows up, it's actually the good thing. Yeah, definitely. Oh, I forgot. I was going to talk about St. Basil. Oh, yeah. So I got this book, On the Human Condition by St. Basil the Great. It's a collection of some of his homilies, but he has one in here called Homily Explaining that God is not the cause of evil. And we saw in Gnosticism that they blame God for evil in the world, in the cosmos. But, so this is just kind of fleshing out what we talked about earlier, how the Christian view of evil is not that it's an equal and opposite force to good, but that it's a privation or negation of good, and it has no ontological substance itself. It's just a shadow of something that's real. That's not to say it doesn't have real effects in the world, but he talks about how God is a physician, and this is good, because he talks about experiences in the fallen world that seem oppressive and that we have to suffer through while we're here, but that if we have faith in God and we can suffer through them with patience and faith, that they always end up for our good. So he describes God as a surgeon, and all these painful things that happen to us are him cutting things away, like tumors, and correcting something that's wrong in us. And we experience that sometimes as evil, but it's for our salvation and it's for our benefit, which is pretty starkly the opposite of the Gnostic view of things. Yeah, and there's no goodness in the end. It's just an oppression. It's not something that leads you towards like a purgative or some kind of cleansing thing. It's just inherently bad and depressive. Yeah, that purgative and cleansing aspect is really important, and that's to correct our fallenness and to heal our fallenness. Because one thing that the Gnostics kind of get right is that this world as we experience it is not our home. Like, we are meant to escape from the condition that we're in right now, but it's not necessarily through negating or rebelling against the situation, but I guess it's more like suffering through it. And Christ is the model for that because of his crucifixion and resurrection. Like, that's the path to transcendence. Theosis instead of apotheosis. So yeah, St. Basil says, therefore, having learned these things clearly from God, you can distinguish for yourself between the kinds of evil, and know which is real evil, namely sin, whose end is destruction, and what seems evil because it is painful to the senses, but has a capacity for good, such as the distresses that bring about a cessation of sin, whose fruit is the eternal salvation of souls. Stop being displeased with divine providence. In short, do not maintain that God is the cause of evil's existence, nor imagine evil to have a subsistence of its own. For wickedness does not subsist as if it were a living being, nor do we hold that its essence coexists in another subsistence. For evil is a privation of good. The eye was created, but blindness comes into being following the destruction of eyes. Therefore, if the eye did not have a perishable nature, blindness would not have a means of entry. Thus also evil is not in itself in existence, but arises following the maiming of the soul. For neither is it ungenerated, as the impious argue, making the wicked of equal honor to the nature of good, if indeed both are without origin and have come into being from above, nor indeed is it generated. For if all things are of God, how is evil from good? For neither is the ugly from the beautiful, nor vice from virtue. Read the account of the material world's creation, and you will find there all things are good and very good. Accordingly, evil was not created together with good, but neither was the intelligible creation, having come to be from the fashioner, mixed with wickedness when brought into being. For if bodily things did not have evil co-created in themselves, how could the intelligible things, bearing such purity and holiness, have a common subsistence with evil? Yet indeed evil exists, and its activity shows that it is greatly poured forth in all of life. From what source then does it exist, one asks, if it is neither without origin nor created? I mean, I could read pages of this, but the point is that this speaks to, it really contradicts the Gnostic worldview.
Yeah.
Even in just what I read. I mean, later on he talks about like the dominion of the devil and his oppression over us. The devil has remained our opponent because of the fall that came upon us due to his abuse long ago. So the Lord has planned for us wrestling with him so that we would wrestle through obedience and triumph over the adversary. If only he had not set out to become a devil, but remained at the post at which in the beginning he was stationed by the commander. But since he became a rebel, he is the enemy of God, and also an enemy of the human being who has come into existence according to the image of God. For on this account he hates humankind, because he also fights against God, and he hates us both as belonging to the Master and as likenesses of God. Therefore we were joined in battle against his wickedness as a training exercise for our souls by the one who plans human affairs with wisdom and foreknowledge, as a physician uses viper's poison to make medicines for healing. Who then was the devil? What was his rank? What was his dignity? And why, in short, has he been named Satan? He is Satan, therefore, because he stands opposite to the good, for this is what the Hebrew word means, as we have learned in the book of Kings. For it says, the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon. He is a devil, since he himself both collaborates in our sin and becomes our accuser. He rejoices in our destruction while he makes an example of us for the things that we have done. And his nature is bodiless, according to the apostle, who says, our wrestling is not with flesh and blood, but with spirits of wickedness. And his honor is that of a ruler, and his place of rule is in the air, as the same epistle says, against the ruler of the powers of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. For this reason also he is called ruler of the world. So yeah, there's the Lord of this world idea.
So much of what this comes down to is like the presupposed intent of God. Like if you have like an inherent view that the intent, kind of in any situation, it's like a fractal thing. Like if you're a kid and you don't understand how the world works and your parents don't let you eat candy or chocolate or something all the time, like it could feel like an oppression because you don't understand that their intent is actually good for you. And there's things you don't understand. But it could feel oppressive, like you don't get what you want. Your will is not totally, satiated, so you're annoyed about it. But if you have an understanding that, the intent is good of that which provides and creates and sustains all things, then it's a lot easier to look at it in a way where you're not just like, the world's bad and God hates me and this is, metal music and just like, this is all so mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you can compare the Christian reaction to that information to like the sort of the metal ethos of sex, drugs, and rock and roll and escapism, like to St. Basil just kind of spelled out, like this is an arena where we struggle for our salvation. Yeah,
it's presupposed in the Christian view that your struggles can have the potential to lead towards a better version of yourself. Mm-hmm. And in the other one, it's definitely... it's like someone who's Christian or struggles and gets some kind of cancer or something that most people would be totally destroyed by. They can look at it as you know, something that helps towards their salvation, or something that helps them in their life in a way, where Gnostic guy gets cancer and this is more of like God just punishing him arbitrarily for no reason.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a lot of it is just like what you think about the intent of God or the universe. And if you have the idea that there's a good intent behind it, even bad things, you could be like, oh, like this is just going to be turned to good somehow. Yeah. Where if you have a more childlike or like, you know, angsty teen version, then anything bad that happens to you, you don't even look for how it could be changed or through some kind of alchemy into something better. It's just, you're just going to be reminded that you feel like the structure of the universe is evil because God did it that way. Yeah. Because you're trapped here.
Yeah. And the true alchemy is like the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And we just celebrated his incarnation, and that is such a central doctrine, because God became man. The immortal becomes mortal and suffers death. Like the deathless one gives himself over to death to restore our nature.
There's that quote. I forget who it was, but
that's St. Augustine quote.
Is it an Augustine quote? It's so good.
Yeah. Oh, I hope you still have that.
I do think I have it still.
Yeah, you should read that. But that's all to say that, man, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, it's Augustine of Hippo, Sermons 191.1. Man's maker was made man, that he, ruler of the stars, might nurse at his mother's breast, that the bread might hunger, that the fountain thirst, the light sleep, the way be tired on its journey, and that the truth might be accused of false witness. The teacher be beaten with whips, the foundation be suspended on wood, that the strength might grow weak, that the healer might be wounded, and that life might die.
It's so beautiful. And that's another thing that turns Gnosticism on its head, because the creator who supposedly enslaved us here came here and took that burden on himself to free us from it. And you see echoes of that in Gnosticism, like the idea that the true good God sends emissaries, but for them, it's the snake. It's not Christ. And that's so profound, like that God would lower himself in that way. Yeah. And it's such an anti-Gnostic idea. Yeah. But as we saw in this paper, the metalheads just kind of allow themselves to be overcome by the despair of living in an oppressive world. Yeah. And so they create their own like illusory fantasy world of escapism through just getting high and being slutty and all of the things that they named.
Yeah, they don't look at the world as like an opportunity for growth or as like trials to go towards God. They look at it as an arbitrary punishment they don't deserve. Yeah. It's just, it feels just like a punishment if your mind is geared the wrong way. Because it's, you know, it's like Buddhists will have the view that like life is suffering. They're not as whiny as the Gnostics about it. But like I see why some people could have turns like that.
Yeah, and I was there. I mean, that's kind of why I started the Metal Mystic channel in the first place, is because I realized I had that cognitive dissonance and that really self-destructive worldview that when you're in it, it's easy to self-justify and make excuses and want to just hold on to those feelings of escapism and pleasure. But if you're honest with yourself, I think you'll see that that's all it is, and that there's not much substance to it, and that it really is just self-destructive. And you really can just see that in the culture of it. And if you just like look at like metal concerts and like all the headbangers and just like it's almost like Dante's Inferno.
It's like mosh pits,
just swirling bodies and just violence and chaos.
Yeah, I've seen mosh pits where people are literally just trying to knock people out, and it's like there's a lot of it makes sense too that kind of violent physical manifestation would come symbolically with like an audio version of some kind of dissonance. Yeah, things like that.
And there is something about it that makes you feel powerful when you really feel powerless, but it's a fleeting thing, and it's just escapism. It's just illusion, and it doesn't actually get you anywhere. Yeah, really.
But a lot of it's like an occult thing in general, like secret knowledge, whether it's true or not. If you feel like you have some secret, it gives you a sense of power. You know,
and that's kind of one thing I noticed about this paper is he doesn't really say anything about the truth of this like religious impulse, or whether he really believes that this is the way things are. I mean, he really is just kind of describing it from like an academic neutral position. And the bands themselves aren't necessarily even consciously. I don't know that like the guys in Black Sabbath were like, oh, we're Gnostics and we want to rebel against the Demiurge.
Yeah,
like,
probably
they
not.
probably read about stuff like that, but I don't know if they were actually consciously putting those themes in.
Yeah.
I think he's just kind of describing what he sees and how it relates, but I think it is pretty insightful into that spirit that's behind that kind of music. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about that. Now, how do we wrap this one up? It's hard to wrap up. We don't know how to wrap up episodes, but you know.
Yeah, we're not professionals at ending episodes yet, so have patience. Follow our Twitters. You have a Twitter? You have what's your handle?
Yeah, we might as well put in plugs at the end. So yeah, like I said, I am the Metal Mystic on YouTube and Twitter. Check out my King Diamond video. I got another one coming soon. The process is like painfully slow, but it's gonna come out. Hopefully by the time people are hearing this.
And your video is doing really good. It's like totally crushed recently.
I could not. I did not expect it to blow up like that. I guess. I mean, there's been a lot of engagement with it. It was definitely really divisive, and you can go and read some of the comments, and they're definitely entertaining. And maybe there's some edifying conversations going on down there, but.
And wherever these get released, we should in the descriptions we should have links to stuff. We have a Twitter for the podcast as well, and it's at Synaxis _podcast.
Yeah, at our Twitter page, follow us on there. We're gonna start being much more active pretty soon. Hopefully, also by the time people have heard this.
Yeah, and if anyone ever has questions or topics or something to go over, just hit us up on one of the Twitters.
Yeah,
because we definitely look at them.
Yeah, for sure. All right, thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. God bless.
Bye.
Ashnazga dura batuluk. Ashnazga gimbatul. Ashnazga thrakatuluk. Ach, burzum shekri.